Truck drivers. What's a creepy story you've got from the middle of nowhere? Not sure if this story is creepy, but it's definitely scary. My father was a truck driver in East Africa in the 80s and early 90s. During the years leading up to the Rwandan genocide, my father was passing through Rwanda. He reached a checkpoint and was forcibly removed from his truck at gunpoint. Apparently he looked like he belonged to the Tutsi tribe, and they put him in a cage with other Tutsi prisoners. He tried communicating that he isn't Rwandan, but no one spoke the same language as him. Every night they would take about 5 people from the cage and slaughter them in front of him. After the 3rd night, he saw a man that spoke a little bit of Swahili, which my dad spoke, and told him that he's not Rwandan and showed him his ID. Somehow that guy got him out, and he was handed the keys to his truck and was on his way. Driving through an abandoned section of Baltimore at 3 in the morning, my CB radio turned itself on and crackled for a bit. Out of nowhere some voice over the radio said in a deep southern drawl, "I ain't got no panties on." I could see up and down the interstate 4 miles and saw not one set of headlights. Driving through rural NM. Bisty area with the crazy melted rock look. No plants or anything. Just rock and sand. Monsoon time. Raining cats and dogs just pouring so hard you could barely see going 20 miles per hour. Thunder and lightning just rocking the car. Sometimes turning into hail and pounding you. Just a nasty storm. Came around the corner, and the whole countryside legit on fire. Like 20 feet tall flames. Hundreds of yards in all directions, while pouring rain at dusk. Just rocks and dirt wildly on fire in the pouring rain. Just slowly drove on. Was totally freaky and surreal. Honestly thought I may have hallucinated it. Checked the news. A propane truck slid off the road going way too fast and apparently busted open pretty violently and lit on fire. Never saw the truck. Must have been behind something. Felt a bit bad after about not stopping. Around 2006 I was driving flatbed. Picked up a load of construction material, drywall, roofing. Don't remember, but it was pre-packaged in boxes, and I remember having to use strap protectors on the load in rural Tennessee. Memory is foggy now, but I want to say it was between Memphis and Nashville, but closer to the intersection of the manuscript, AL-T and state lines. Tarp required, so I strapped everything down, tarped the load, and left the shipper. About 5 miles down the road, in the middle of nowhere woods on a 2-lane road, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind. Found a wide shoulder and pulled over to fix it. I realized that I just flat did a speedy job tarping this load and decide to redo it on the side of the road. Undo all the bungee straps, drag the tarps off, roll them back up, climb up on the load, and start unrolling the tarps again, and I see a guy walking down the same side of the road I'm on, coming towards my truck. I don't think anything about it other than to keep an eye on him cause I'm in the middle of nowhere and continue what I'm doing. About the time I have tarps set in place and I'm climbing down to start hooking the bungee straps back on, this dude is getting close enough that I'm now paying more attention to him than I'm to tarping my load. I grabbed my winch bar and set it on the trailer where I'm working just in case. 8-pound solid metal bar about 4 feet long, tapered to a blunt point on one end and hollow on the other. Used for tightening straps and chains etc. The guy gets to me, and the first thing I notice is his hair. It's like a mullet, but it's patchy as peep. Like he tried to cut his own hair and had a seizure in the process and said peep it good enough to party. The next thing I noticed were his eyes, which I can only describe as off. Like they were clear. I didn't think he was drunk or high or anything, but it also gave me the distinct impression that the elevator didn't go all the way up. Clothes were dirty and not well maintained, with dirty white tennis shoes. Cause I remember he didn't have laces on one shoe and the tongue was noticeably out of place. He stops by me, waits until I acknowledge him, and just says I've got a long walk. I'm like, yeah man, you do. We're in the middle of nowhere. Making it clear there's no ride to be had here. He nods, starts walking by me, continuing on his way, stops at about the driver door on my truck and turns around, comes back to me and repeats himself. I've got a long walk. At this point I explain that I can't give him a ride, insurance and all that. Apologize for not being able to help him out. And he seems to accept this. Turns around and leaves. I wait for him to get a little ways away from my truck and start working on finishing the top job. I still keep an eye on him and he's moving away from me. As I'm putting on the last of the bungee straps, I look over to check where he's at and he's turned around heading back towards me. Now about 100 yards in front of my truck and coming back my way. It looks like he's talking on a cell phone. Has his hand up to his face and I can barely make out his mouth moving. His other hand waving like he's having a conversation with someone. I finish with the straps, grab my winch bar, and I'm climbing into my truck as he's about 10 yards away now. Soon as I'm in the cab, I lock the doors and set the winch bar on the passenger seat just in case. I look at the guy and realize he's not talking on a phone. He's talking to his peeping hand, and now I'm nervous. Cause he doesn't look like he's having a nice pleasant chat. It looks more like an angry conversation. Crank the truck up, put it in gear and just pull out. Didn't look for traffic or anything. As I pass him, he's just looking at me, still holding his hand to his face with this dead ass look on his face, just staring at me. Gave me the creeps. About the time I hit 5th or 6th gear, I look in the mirror and there's no one there. A good buddy of mine is a long haul trucker for my company. A few months ago, he woke up in a parking lot surrounded by police. Some dude had gotten shot and dumped 15 feet from his truck. Years ago I read an answer on a thread with this question about a guy who was riding with his truck driver father as a child. They were in the middle of nowhere and they were coming up on a person laying in the road with no one else around, no cars, etc. His dad blew the horn. They didn't move. He blew it again as he got closer. They didn't move. He told his son to put his head down and cover his eyes, and he ran the person over. When they looked back, a bunch of people who were previously hiding were running out of the woods, and the gist was that his dad knew it was a setup for a robbery or worse and wasn't chancing it with his child in the car. No clue if it was true or not, but I think about that story all the time. I've heard various stories like this one. The one that stood out to me the most is my aunt's friend was driving through New England and decided to take a lesser taken road. It was close to sunset and he's going through these woods like you would any road. He comes around this one bend in the road and sees this car just stopped in the road, kind of off to the side with the horn blaring. There was someone passed out on the steering wheel. He wanted to stop and help, but something just kept tingling up his spine. He slowed to get next to the car, but something inside him made him book it. In his rearview mirror, he saw a large group of people are staring at his car as he drove away, including the guy that was at wheel. This happened to one of my uncle's employees in South Texas near there. He was found laying on the road beaten and bloody. After they got him to the hospital, they found out he was driven down the road and seen someone standing there waving him down. Once he stopped, he was ambushed from the fields and stabbed 4 times and left on the road. Luckily he was in a company truck with a GPS tracker to tell when employees are speeding, so they caught them the next day. After that we were always taught go around, and if you can't, go through. Not a truck driver, but I have one weird story from when I was a kid. My parents always took us on long road trips every summer, and my dad liked to take meandering routes through rural towns to see all the tourist traps. One trip, we passed through a little town in Illinois, the kind you miss if you sneeze. This one had mannequins. Every house and business was only populated by mannequins. I don't remember seeing any people. Everything looked maintained and clean, so someone was at least caring for the place. There weren't any signs or anything indicating it was for tourists. Just a convenience store / bait shop with a sign reading "Eat here, get worms." My dad drove a truck between Edinburgh and London and tells this story often. He was driving down the motorway and looked to his right. Saw a woman with a "mistrunchable bun" as he describes it, staring at him with a terrified expression from a car next to him. Before he really knows how to react, the car pulls off at the next exit and my dad, although shaken, carries on. About half an hour later, a different car with a different driver pulls alongside my dad, with the same woman in the passenger seat, with the same expression on her face. My dad thinks back peep this and plans to pull into the next services to report, as even if it's nothing/misunderstanding. Better to be safe than sorry, right? Anyway, the car disappears before he can get any details plates etc, and he thinks there is no point calling the police with no details, so he carries on driving. Literally about 4 hours later, almost in London, yet another car pulls alongside him with the same woman, same mistrunchable hair, same terrified expression, except this time she appears to be screaming at my dad through the window. So my dad pulls over into a lobby and calls the police. Apparently they have received 3 other calls about the same woman/car in the same area in the last few minutes. It is unfortunately anticlimactic as he never heard anything more about it, but he didn't see her again, and although he kept an eye on the news, didn't see anything about it. Hopefully it's just a giant coincidence. Who knows? The repeating nature of this one reminds me of one weird story back when I was in high school. It was summer and my dad's birthday, so we drove to a casino 2 hours away to watch a boxing match with my uncle. It finishes and we drive back the same night. We are nearing a canyon with no phone reception, so we call my mom and tell her we'll be home soon. Canyon usually takes about 30 minutes with no traffic. It's around midnight, so we enter the canyon and we are all pretty tired. To keep us talking we start telling stories, most of them creepy stories. This goes on for a while, and it feels like time is passing in a haze. We pass this, but in the canyon and suddenly I get deja vu. I'm convinced we already passed that before. All of us have driven this canyon 100 times, and know the layout. We keep talking, and then we pass the same but again. This time I point it out, and my dad and uncle notice the time. It's 1 AM, and we are still not home. So we all start to get a bit freaked out. We stop talking and just watch the road slowly pass by. Now that we are paying attention though, time seems to catch up. We exit the canyon around 1:15 AM and call my mom, who is freaked out she hadn't heard from us. We still to this day have no idea where that extra 45 minutes or so went. I was driving through eastern Washington on some state roads. There were no rest stops or cities, but I had done the route enough to know there were these massive dirt areas every 40 miles, where you could park safely away from the road. I decided to call it a night, and closed my blinds, and laid down to watch something on my phone. After roughly an hour I hear someone try to open the driver's side door. I haven't heard any vehicles on the road the whole time I'm parked, but I get up to peek out the curtains. As I'm looking out into the blackness of the driver's side window I hear them try the passenger side door. I peek down from the top of the curtain, but can't see anything, so I start the truck and kick on the lights. I'm fairly freaked out at this point, so I'm still not opening the curtains, but peeking through gaps. Nothing. Nobody is standing near either of my doors, or parked within sightline. I take a deep breath and close the sleeper curtains too, because for some reason that's going to make things better, right? After laying back down and convincing myself that something blew against the truck and it only sounded like the doors, it was fairly windy outside and a lot of flat ground, I hear what sounds like someone trying to pry open the vents on the sleeper. The door handles start clicking again and the truck starts shifting like someone is climbing on it. I hit the little alarm button in the sleeper hoping to spook them off, but it does nothing but add to the noise of door handles, fingers tapping on windows and chassis, and the hiss of air coming out of the suspension. Then suddenly it stops. A few moments where I can only hear myself breathing and my heart pounding, before I hear another truck approach, and then drive by. I spent the next few hours waiting for whatever it was to come back, but it never did. In the morning I couldn't find any footprints or damage to my truck, but on every window were tiny human looking handprints, like a toddler had licked their hand and stuck it to my window over and over. Raccoons? Driving through a national park in the middle of the night, going through a slow stretch at about 30 km/h. Every so often I think I see something put them my window and beside me. Just a glimpse of movement. When I knock though I don't catch it. Finally on about the third time I whip my head around, and this time I recognize it's a huge black wolf following alongside my truck just off the highway. I only saw it for a few seconds before Jay had to focus back on the road, but it was absolutely lovely yet unsettling. Not technically a truck driver, but my cousin works at a truck stop in Kansas. She told me about some guy who parked his truck and got out. A woman got out of the passenger seat. It was kinda cold, so the trucker was wearing a coat and hat. But the woman was wearing summer cloths. My cousin thought nothing of it and did her whole hi welcome in. The trucker bought a coffee, but the woman just stood there in the doorway. Now my cousin was freaked out. She didn't want to be rude, but she was a teenage girl alone in a gas station in the middle of nowhere. "Excuse me, miss. Do you need anything?" she asked. "Who are you talking to?" the truck driver asked when he got to the checkout. "The woman who got out of your truck?" My cousin pointed, but the woman had disappeared. She told me she had never seen a look of pure terror on a man's face. He just required "Oh no," got his coffee and left. The woman did not get back into his truck and my cousin couldn't find her in the store. She says it was one of the most terrifying experiences she had ever had while on that job. Not a truck driver, but I've spent the past 4 years driving every day/night for work. I was in a fairly rural part of Mississippi somewhere between Clarksdale and Greenwood. Important note, it's all 2-lane highway, the 250-mile drive home. The weather had turned pretty sour as I was leaving Clarksdale. I called my wife, told her there was high wind advisories and very possible tornado threats throughout the Delta, and I'd call her as soon as I made it to a safe area again. I had already been working for 14 hours when I got in the truck, so I had ate dinner and grabbed some coffee to stay awake and alert. Now, if you have never driven through flat farmland at night for 100 miles, it's very fatiguing and spooky without inclement weather. I had driven maybe 30 miles out into the farmland when hail started bouncing off my truck. Being a manuscript native, I knew in July hail meant tornado. I pull off to the side, I'm in the middle of nowhere, no lights to be seen, no cars behind or in front of me, and start looking for the storm/tornado I believe is approaching. I rolled the passenger window down and shined a bright flashlight off into the night. Nothing there. Turn to the driver's side and this guy has his face pushed against the glass, grinning from ear to ear. I screamed and he was gone. I slammed the truck in drive and took off. We have all the time running cameras on our trucks. I got to the first safe place to stop and called my wife. I didn't want to scare her, so I didn't mention the guy or the hailstorm. I did however pull the SD card and check the cameras. I promise you this guy never popped up on my front or rear cameras. I've always played it off as my imagination. I will say I don't drive through the Delta in the dark anymore if I don't absolutely have to. I used to deliver hotshot freight across the Great Plains/Minnesota area. One night around 2 AM I was hauling across North Dakota trying to reach Montana by morning. I was delivering a particularly valuable tractor part that a farm desperately needed for the following day. I began to notice some highway hypnosis sneaking up on me, but it didn't really bother me because I'd been through it hundreds of times before. Anyone who has driven across North Dakota knows that it is incredibly flat. Like, really flat. There also tends to be very straight and long roads. It's somewhat easy to see things on the road that are far away, even at night. I noticed something long on the road, spanning my entire lane, approximately half a mile in front of me. I slowed down a little and prepared to move into the opposite lane, thinking it was some retread off a blown tire. As I got closer I noticed it was 2 people, laying head to toe across the entire lane. I swerved into the other lane, successfully avoiding them, and came to an almost complete stop. But they didn't move. Not an inch. I was just about to back up and check on them when I remembered a story that an old graybeard colleague of mine told me. He told me that in certain remote areas, people will lie down in the middle of the road and wait for a car or truck to stop and see what's going on. At that point, the road layers along with whoever else is hiding in the nearby bushes will beat the speep out of the driver and steal his vehicle, leaving him in the middle of nowhere. I decided not to back up, and when the 2 people in the road saw me put my truck back in gear and drive away, they both got up and walked toward the shoulder. I called the police and explained what happened. but we were so far away from civilization that I doubt anything came of it. Thanks to that old greybird, I got to keep my truck, my job, and my teeth. I was in the middle of absolutely nowhere in Texas and getting so tired, and there were absolutely no lights anywhere around me but the stars. I guess I kinda messed up a turn at one of those forks in the road when a calm voice came loud over the CB. "Driver, looks like it's time for you to pull over and grab some sleep." So I did. I'm not ignoring invisible citizen band Jesus. "Driver, looks like it's time for you to pull over and grab some cake." The obligatory not a truck driver, but a second-hand story I heard. My great uncle drove big trucks. Living in the middle of nowhere, sometimes people would leave trash on the road. And since he had a big truck, he'd just smash into said boxes or paper and continue on. One day he was coming up on a cardboard box and just had the urge to swerve and miss this one. He misses it and passes by with no incident. Looks in his rear view to look at the box, and out pops a kindergarten age little kid that just heads back to their house as nothing happened. Trucker here. I think the best creepy thing that ever happened to me was I was heading from Tucson as up into Salt Lake City. Well, this was a few years ago, and the main highway had been taken out in a flash flood, was under construction, so I had to take a weird detour through the mountains in lower Utah. Well, it was getting late, and I was getting tired, so I pulled off onto the shoulder and went to sleep in my bunk. Now this was in the middle of nowhere. Closest town was like 40 miles away, so it is completely pitch black outside once I turn the lights off. Anyway, around 4 AM I wake up because I'm hearing something messing with my truck, like playing with the air and power cables between my cab and the trailer, which is literally 6 inches from where my head is at but on the outside of the cab. Then I feel something climb onto the landing that's on the back of my truck, and it shakes my whole truck. So I'm guessing something around 200 to 300 pounds was climbing around back there. I'm thinking like a mountain lion or a bear. At this point I'm wide the peep awake, and I want to get this thing away from me. So I slam my hand into my cab wall trying to scare whatever is out there. Slam hard enough to really make it loud. I then hear someone, a male, scream bloody murder, and I hear them fall off the back of my truck. I then hear about 15 other people all around my truck yelling. I climb up front, turn on my lights, and illuminate a squad of Army reserves doing their midnight truck march and capture drills. Turns out these guys were supposed to go find an abandoned truck and secure it for their midnight drills. That truck was 3 miles back down the road. They were not expecting me to be sleeping there and thought I was part of the drill. I'm ex-military, so after explaining I was not part of their test and legit was just there out of coincidence, we laughed it off. They had to radio to their CO and tell him I was there and not have the other squads bother me. FedEx contractor. I'm in one of those big box trucks. Anyways, I finished a long delivery day, and I swear to whatever peeping gods you believe in that I was hearing voices in my cab. It wasn't the radio. It wasn't my tinnitus. It wasn't my subconscious. I was hearing whispered voices in my right ear that were coming from the passenger seat. The voices continued even after I had gotten back to my hub, clocked out, and hopped in my own car to go home. They only stopped when I left the parking lot. It only happened that night. I still have no peeping idea what the hell it was because I had ruled everything else out. Literally reposting my comment from another thread just like this. I work for a railroad. Not necessarily remote, but sometimes it's just a conductor and engineer cruising along /-10 miles per hour on very isolated, fairly wooded track. I've heard a few older guys mention something about a family or a man with a suitcase. Something along those lines. Don't really remember walking down the track with no concerns. Constant blowing of the horn, flashing of the lights, etc. Just kept walking down the track, then disappearing. Near Weatherly, PA. I also experienced a pretty intense trip myself one night coming home from New Jersey. Saw my first dead body laying along the rail, which in itself was kinda interesting. Then the only other part of my trip where we were required to run at a slow speed. I heard the craziest blood-curdling scream I have ever heard in my entire life. One of the nights I will probably remember until I retire. My uncle was driving between Great Falls and Helena at around 3 AM. He had his high beams on as it was a lonely drive and quiet highway. In the distance he saw something cross the median and started to slow his approach, thinking it was a deer. As he got closer, he realized it was standing up, and so he slowed down to about 30 miles per hour. He realized what it was and started to panic. A man in blue coveralls with a pig's head. Not a mask, but literally the head of a pig on his shoulder. My uncle moved to the left lane, and as he passed, pig head lunged at the truck. My uncle didn't stop to check if he'd grabbed on till he was in the safety of Helena. Nothing was out of the ordinary there, but on that stretch of road now, he doesn't slow down for anything. Not technically a truck driver, but I used to work as a field technician in the oil industry, so I spent a lot of time driving through remote areas of Canada at odd hours. One very strange and eerie experience sticks with me. I was in either northeast BC or northwest Alberta, can't remember the exact location, driving late at night, when I noticed a very large black shape on the road in front of me. Thinking it was a moose, I stepped on the brakes, coming to a stop only a few feet from it. Despite being so close, and having my headlights shining directly on it, I still couldn't tell what I was looking at. It was vaguely the shape of a full-legged animal, but very big, probably about 6 feet tall. Aside from that, it was completely featureless. I couldn't make out any details whatsoever. No shine from its eyes. Nothing. And then I noticed there were more of them in the ditch on both sides of the road. 5 or 6. Or maybe more. All the same as the black shape on the road in front of me. None of them were moving. They didn't look like physical objects or living things. More like just large patches of absolute darkness. After I got over my shock, dread started to set in, and I drove around the thing on the road and sped off. I don't really believe this was a paranormal experience. I had been driving for 8 hours through the middle of the night, and I was exhausted. Most likely, it was a hallucination caused by a lack of sleep and spending too long staring straight ahead into the dark. But it was still a very unsettling experience. As a crew guy of an off-road racing team in Baja California, Mexico, I got to test drive some rigs and trucks. So technically truck driver. We were driving down south along Sea of Cortez with a buddy at night at this 4-hour dirt road to Gonzaga, which is pretty much in the middle of peeping nowhere in the desert. And we see the lights of a car behind coming down fast and now effectively tailing us, and the bastard had bar mount headlights on top, or what seemed like it, which are super bright. It's normal always that locals and gringos get wasted in the nearest now former dew-covered spring breaker town, and then go down this road super fast to test their rigs, since there's no police there. So I try waving him off, to get the guy to keep them lights low, since he's blinding us, but he isn't slowing down a bit nor turn his roof lights off, and it was a dangerous super dark road. Finally, near a curve near the shore, I found a spot to bail off the road without crashing, and we see lights passing by us super fast and going straight to the curb, and we were like, that's it. He is going to crash down to the sea, but the lights didn't fall and kept going straight into the beach and the sea, and then pitched up abruptly to the night sky and disappeared. We didn't say a word for a minute or so, and then my buddy goes, "Did you see it?" And I say, "The peeping flying truck." Didn't talk about anymore, as simply it didn't make sense to talk about it, or with anyone else when we arrived. I've seen some rather screwed up stuff over the years. From bad wrecks, drug addicts, panhandlers and more. There used to be a small rest area in North Dakota on US 52 at the intersection of ND 30 near Sikeston. I came out of the building after using the facilities and got ready to leave. As I was starting to pull out, a guy opened his car door. The angle was just right to see that he was buck naked. Then he gets out of his car and starts walking around his car. I'm not sure if he was a druggie or just thought this is a good way to pick up a truck driver I've never met before. I just drove away and didn't look back. Maybe that isn't creepy in the sense that op meant it, but I thought it was. One story that was creepy to me was that I was driving across Kansas on I-70 headed west. There is a pretty long stretch out there that's just a couple little towns and not much else. As the night wore on, I realized I had been passed several times by this beat up old motorhome. Several people sat with their noses almost pressed to the window, watching me with creepy interest as it passed. Every time. And I never noticed where I repassed them at. A couple times I swear they passed me twice where there was no rest areas or exits to pull off at. I would have seen them stopped somewhere, but yet, here they were passing me again. They all looked like some variant of Charles Manson or some other freaky type. Had me pretty uptight by the time I got to the tar truck stop in Limon and stopped for the night. And almost every driver I know has seen stuff late at night that just can't be explained. Maybe it's maybe not. But I've seen very large man-like shadows cross the road way too fast for their size several times. I ain't saying it's a Bigfoot. Never got a clear view. Was always out at the end of the headlights where I couldn't be entirely sure I even seen anything. But it sure looked like a large something crossing a whole road in just a couple of steps. Really weird. I live in Kansas and have driven that western stretch many times on my way to Colorado. It's absolutely nothing for so long, and the few tiny towns you do pass are mostly rundown nothings as well. I've never had to drive it in the dark, but I would easily get spooked. And for whatever reason, we seem to have a lot of people in this stupid state that like to peep with you late at night on the interstate if you're the only two cars around. 3 significant times I remember where one of those ash peeps would pass me, slow down in front of me until I had to pass them for them to then speed back up, stay beside me for too long, get back in front of me, and repeat until we came across another car and they started on them while I fly forward to get away. Had someone once follow me into the toll line after doing what I just described for a half hour or so when several others were open and empty. I had a K-tag and the worker waved me through, but I stopped and told her the vehicle behind me had been following me for miles and miles. How they were passing and slowing down and now followed me into this lane. She told me they didn't have a K-tag, so she would make sure to take her time in getting their money to give me time to get ahead. Well, they then back up and go into another lane. She tells me to sit and wait for them to drive on. Turned on the red X so no other cars would come behind me. That other car waited about 2 minutes just sitting there. The lady called the other worker in the stand and told them to get them out because they had been following me and were being really sketchy. They finally pulled off slowly and drove slowly down the highway. I sat at her toll for about 5 more minutes. Got off on the very first exit and went through town to get to a road that led to my home a few miles outside of town because I was afraid that car may have pulled over on the highway ahead to wait for me. This was at about 2 in the morning also. People who do that speep. It's extremely creepy and unsettling. Not exactly creepy but definitely terrifying. My father was a truck driver and he was driving through a smaller town in Northern California hauling tomatoes. Suddenly he got incredibly tired. Wasn't low on sleep or deprived at all but ended up passing out at the wheel. Last thing he saw was the light of the town in front of him. He woke up about 2 hours later on the other side of town, perfectly parked on the side of the road. He swears something was looking out for him that night. I'm not a truck driver, but the story is from a truck driver. I was working the overnight shift from Friday night into Saturday morning at a gas station. At about 6 AM a semi pulls into the fuel aisle. Driver gets out and almost runs into the store clearly shaken. His face is completely white and he is obviously upset. My first thought was the poor man had hit someone on the road. We get a lot of drunks walking across a 4-lane highway in front of the store. So I ask what's wrong. He looks at me for a second and is like, I'm not crazy. Now I'm thinking great, I'm here all alone and this guy's losing it. I say of course not. I just saw something huge on the side of the road. Like a deer or bear? We had a bear get in the dumpster last week. No bigger than a bear on its back legs. Maybe a big person. It picked up a dead buck on the side of the road and carried it over its shoulder into the woods. I can only stare at him. My brain cannot deal with this information this late in a shift. A local comes up to the counter to get his usual and the guy tells him the story. The local says, that's the Bigfoot that lives near the county line. The truck driver and I are both looking at this guy like he has two heads. He has to be joking. This trucker pays for his fuel at record speed and leaves never to be seen again. The local still insists it's Bigfoot. I just don't got in the woods cause I don't know. Oh, that's the Bigfoot. Lives right over yonder. The peepine what? My father's told me this story maybe 1,000 times. My family, as well as a couple of uncles and my oldest cousin went on a trip from Mexico City to Acapulco when I was barely a year old. Back home in the middle of the night the good old days when you could travel at night. The car broke down and a police car quickly came to our help. There were 3 policemen in the car and the chief offered to take my dad to the nearest gas station where he could find a mechanic and told the other 2 officers to stay with our car. My dad says they seem absolutely not pleased with the order until the chief told them don't worry, there's a woman and 2 children. That seemed to calm the 2 officers. Driving to the gas station on the police car, my dad asked the chief what was all that about. The chief told him that there had been many accidents in that part of the road, that's why they were able to find our car so quickly. All of the accidents involved young men traveling without female or child company. Those who had survived said that they crashed because they could see a very beautiful woman next to the road, but once they came close to her, she turned out to be just a rotting corpse staring at them, and they crashed because they were paralyzed by fear. Not a trucker, but I had a college teammate from Miami tell a story that he swears on to this day. He and his girlfriend were making the drive to Naples late night on a 2-lane road through the Everglades and had been in a line of cars behind an 18-wheeler for multiple miles. She fell asleep and he was surfing for something to listen to on the radio. Only one station came in clearly enough to be tolerable, so he gave it a listen. The DJ came on and said something along the lines of the stars are extra bright in the Everglades tonight. If you're driving through there, pull off and take a look. He said he normally wouldn't even think of it, but for some reason felt compelled to that night. He woke up his girlfriend. She was annoyed and didn't want to, but he convinced her it would be worth it. They stopped and just took in the stars for 5 to 10 minutes. He said it was the most amazing sky he's ever seen. They get back on the road and drive another few minutes and come across a massive accident. The truck they were following had jackknifed and took out a handful of vehicles that were following. He said there are multiple fatalities, but I've never been able to find a new story about it to confirm. Probably would have been in 2005ish. They most likely would have been involved if not for that random DJ on the only radio station to come in that night. DJ Jesus. Jesus took the radio. Romans killed the New Testament star. Not me, but my Costa Rican tour guide told us a really scary story that happened to a former employee of his who would drive a truck carrying construction related speed to different sites. Mind you, where they were building was miles away from the nearest city. A lot of Costa Rica is preserved jungle. Luckily the government is environmentally conscious and isn't just cutting everything down like Brazil is now. Anyway, this dude was the first, not the only, to have this happen to him. Apparently when he was driving behind a line of construction trucks on their way to the site late at night, he saw a white pale woman throw herself in the way of the trucks in front of him. He yelled it into their radio to stop and check for her, but when they stopped they didn't find a body/blood and no one saw her except him. This happened again on the same trip and yet again. When they stopped they couldn't find the girl and no one, except the guy who called it, saw anything. The other workers thought he was high or something. One other time he had to go out to the site by himself at night. It had been some time after the incident with the pale woman, so he didn't think it was a big deal. He exited the car at one point to take a leak near a clearing, and that's when he felt it started to get really cold. He turned around and peering out from a tree in the distance he saw the same pale woman staring at him. Dude booked it back to his car and got in the driver's seat, turned it on, and was about to speed the F out when he took one last look at his left side rear view mirror and saw her much closer and still looking at him. He kept that story to himself thinking no one would believe him until a new worker claimed to see the same thing and told my tour guide their boss. When the boss told the truck driver what the new guy saw, the truck driver told him about the second encounter with the woman in the forest. Creepy speep. Edit. Peeped up. He drove the car the second time, not a truck. Not exactly relevant, but still creepy AF. My dad is a trucker, and about 20 some years ago, a woman committed suicide by running out in front of him. He said that every night around the time she died, the cab of his truck would drop a few degrees in temperature, and he felt a presence. He said this went on for a few weeks, and finally he spoke out to her and said he forgave her and wished that she had peace. He said he never experienced the eeriness again. My uncle was a long-haul trucker for almost 30 years. He did a lot of runs through Texas and said that some of the small towns gave him a weird vibe. Like he absolutely didn't belong there as an outsider and should just make his delivery and leave as soon as possible. I worked at the Nevada nuclear test site, decommissioning old buildings. How much time do you have, lol? One of the creepiest days was when I was sent with an end-dump load of non-hazmat material to the general landfill, which I had never been to before. Somehow I missed the turn and ended up at an armed gate with machine guns pointed at me. Very uncomfortable. Once I explained my mistake, I was quite hastily turned around. Still not knowing exactly where my turn was, a very nondescript desert road was what I was looking for. I headed back. I turned on the next dirt road I came to and ended up at the Sedan crater. Went and smoked a cigarette on the observation deck all by my lonesome. My hands were still shaking from the run-in with the armed guards. Another was when delivering a hazmat load to Area 25. They had begun using robots to guard the area. They were still in beta testing, and someone may have just been peeping with me, but the damn thing perceived my truck as a threat and blocked my ability to move. I went inside the building, and 15 minutes later it had moved on. I've got a few. Being stalked by, my gut says, a skinwalker outside of Cedar City, but I've told that one elsewhere on Reddit. One of the worst was when I was parked at a dirt turnout in the Arizona desert between Cameron and Page for the night. This is out in Navajo country, I believe. About 2 AM I woke up to scratching at the window of my sleeper. Went on for about 15 minutes. I'm sitting there in the dark, scared to death, wondering what the peep's happening with my Bowie knife in my hand. After it ended, I waited another 15 minutes or so before I opened my curtain and looked out the windows. Couldn't see anything outside, and I was still the only one parked there. Got out the next morning, and all I found were some footprints coming to the truck and eventually walking back into the desert. Haven't parked there since. I always stop at a small truck stop in Cameron now. Not me, but an ex-girlfriend's cousin's uncle. Yeah, I know it's a friend of a friend situation, but it was a well-known tale among the family. He was driving on a Mexican road at night. He felt a call of nature, so he parked on the sideway and jumped off the truck. He walked to relieve himself, and while doing that he felt a presence beside him. He pointed his flashlight at his side and saw, standing beside him, a small deformed person. It was naked and had his face bloated, and he was standing just there. The driver, ex-GF's cousin's uncle, ran away to his truck, jumped in, and drove away from there. There's been a lot since I talked with my ex. We are cool, but not too much in touch. But if you want to know more, I could ask her about the fuzzy details. Not me, but my mom told me a story about one late night out trucking. Her husband was sleeping in the back, and she was starting to get super tired and struggling to stay awake. She heard another trucker on the CV and started chatting with him. He helped her stay awake for the run until she stopped off at a truck stop until her husband could take over. That next morning, she told her husband what happened, and he told her the CV was broken, and that was impossible. Truck driving. Many years ago I did that. Long hours, and always tired, because the dispatcher always thought you were behind. But there were some good stories. This one guy, when he saw another company truck at a rest stop, and the driver was sleeping over the steering wheel, he would put on this gorilla mask he had, and stand on the running board and knock on the window. Of course the driver invariably almost suffered a heart attack, and a couple even chased him around threatening great bodily harm. I was sitting in my truck one day waiting to load in a line of other trucks. One guy opens his door and stands on the running board like he is pissing off the side. Except he has this huge dildo in his hand. The next truck coming around the corner, the driver stared wide-eyed at this guy, who then proceeded to casually tap the huge penis against the hot exhaust pipe as if he is shaking off a couple of piss drops. The other driver almost hit the building.